What's the worst? I'm Mr. Beat. Hopefully I'm not the worst. Anyway, I've been teaching American history to students in the classroom and online for nearly 15 years now, and during that time, I've come across some pretty crappy laws that the United States government has passed. Hey, shame on them for that, by the way. So what makes a law crappy? Well, it's crappy if it's a law that has had negative consequences on a bunch of people. It's hurt a bunch of people. In some cases, though, these laws had negative consequences on a smaller number of people, but those negative consequences had such a negative impact that they still made this list. Look, this is not going to be easy. There were a lot of crappy laws. Here are the 10 worst federal laws in American history, in my opinion. And yes, we're talking about federal laws, not state laws. If we got into state laws, I mean, don't get me started on some of the crazy state laws that have been passed in this country. I'm looking at you, Indiana. Spam texts and calls are super annoying. We all get them. We all hate them. But why do we get them? Well, one of the reasons why we get so many spam texts and calls is because big companies can't seem to keep our data safe. Recently, Ticketmaster was hacked and the data of 560 million users was put up for sale on the dark web. The data stolen includes full names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, and credit card data. And unfortunately, Ticketmaster is doing nothing about it. All of these companies happily collect our data but do nothing to protect it. That's why I use Aura, the sponsor of this video. Aura alerts me when my data has been part of a data breach or leaked on the dark web. It gives me fast fraud alerts if anyone tries to use that data to access my credit or bank accounts. And it removes my information from data broker websites so I get less spam. I also get things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus protection, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance. I get this all in one app at one affordable price. If my info was compromised in the Ticketmaster data breach, I wouldn't worry because Aura is always on, keeping my data safe. Look, I'm not leaving myself or my family vulnerable to data breaches. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/MrBeat and try your first 2 weeks for free. The link's in the description of this video. All right, get pumped up. Yeah! It's time for some horrible laws. Number 10, the Alien and Sedition Acts. So yeah, these are actually 4 different laws, often grouped together, understandably so, since they are all related. First, there was the Naturalization Act, passed on June 18th, 1798. It basically just made it harder to become a citizen, which, okay, fine, whatever. But then there was the Alien Friends Act, passed on June 25th, 1798, which said you couldn't be friends with aliens. What the heck? Just kidding. Bad dad joke there. Nah, the Alien Friends Act actually allowed the president to easily imprison or deport any foreigner who they thought was dangerous. Imagine if the president had that power today. Goodness gracious. The Alien Enemies Act, passed on July 6, 1798, gave the president even more powers to detain foreigners during a war. And last but least, there was the Sedition Act, passed on July 14, 1798. It basically made it illegal to talk trash about the federal government or make up fake news about the federal government. It clearly went against, the First Amendment, and was often used by the Federalist Party to get revenge on their political enemies. Number 9, the Authorization for Use of Military Force of 2001. Often simply referred to as the AUMF, it quickly passed on September 18th, 2001 in response to the September 11th attacks, which happened exactly a week prior. Although it originally was meant to authorize the president to use, quote, necessary and appropriate force against those who, quote, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, it has been kept on the books ever since to justify a seemingly endless war on terrorism. The AUMF has given the president huge powers to unilaterally launch military operations all over the world in the name of, quote, stopping terrorism. Presidents have used the AUMF to launch military campaigns in at least 22 countries. Because of the AUMF, the war on terrorism is still going on today, 23 years after the September 11th attacks. In my view, it gives the federal government basically an unlimited amount of power and money to wage endless war without any debate or input from the public. Number 8, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Passed on June 17, 1930, it increased tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods. Named after its two main proponents, U.S. Senator Reed Smoot and U.S. Representative Willis Hawley, these tariffs were supposed to encourage people to buy American-made stuff by increasing the cost of imported stuff. Instead, it led to trading partners retaliating by raising their tariff rates and ultimately froze international trade, causing companies' sales to drop everywhere. In fact, most economic historians say this one law dramatically made the Great Depression worse. Soon after it went into effect, banks across the country began to fail. By the end of 1931, nearly 2,300 banks had failed, and $1.7 billion in deposits were lost. Number 7, the Controlled Substances Act. Let's get this out of the way first. Drugs are bad, okay?
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
That said, many people tend to forget that all drugs used to be completely legal. Yes, even in the United States. It was just over 100 years ago that you began to see laws pop up prohibiting drugs, but criminalizing something doesn't get rid of it, especially drugs. Just because drugs became illegal didn't mean people stopped using drugs. Instead, now they bought them on the black market. And since black markets operate outside of the law, I mean, they often don't care about other laws either. Prohibition of drugs almost always leads to a rise of organized crime, a rise of violence, and a rise of drug overdose deaths. Which brings us to the Controlled Substances Act, passed on May 1st, 1971, as part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. The law criminalized drug abuse and said, without any evidence whatsoever, that marijuana, aka cannabis, and psilocybin were just as dangerous as heroin and more dangerous than cocaine. Ever since, people who have needed medical treatment have instead been sent to prison with violent offenders. The Controlled Substances Act led to the so-called war on drugs, one of the biggest failures in American history. The American federal government has spent well over $1 trillion fighting it, and drug use has stayed pretty much the same since it started. Yep, the drugs won the war on drugs. This war on drugs has led to the United States imprisoning more of its own people by far than any other country on the planet. And this war on drugs has disproportionately targeted people of color. Number 6, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Yeah, being a Kansan myself, I've made lots of videos about this horrible law, and frankly, I'm getting sick of it. Passed on May 30th, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, opened them for settlement, and allowed the new settlers to determine whether they would be admitted to the Union as a free state or slave state. What? Yeah, this predictably caused a mad rush of both pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to Kansas. Pro-slavery folks from Missouri would cross the border into Kansas to illegally vote in elections, and Jayhawkers, or anti-slavery Kansans, began retaliating. All of this escalated into political violence between the two groups and as many as 200 people being murdered. The violence was so bad that the territory got the nickname, quote, Bleeding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a major cause of the American Civil War. In fact, some historians argue the American Civil War really began in Kansas in the 1850s because of this law. Number 5, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Authorized on August 10th, 1964, this was the law that gave the president, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, the full power to use conventional military force in Southeast Asia. Ultimately, it led to the dramatic rise of troops in the Vietnam War, a war which killed as many as 3.8 million people, including 58,220 Americans. And the whole thing was based on a lie. Just a few days prior, an American destroyer named the USS Maddox was hanging out off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin when it spotted North Vietnamese torpedo boats. It fired a warning shot, and the torpedo boats fired shots back at them. 2 days later, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox again, and this is what led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and thus full-out war in Vietnam. Except, here's the thing. The second attack never happened at all. Now, the sailors on the USS Maddox thought they were being attacked, but nope, they were not. We all found out that this attack was completely made up decades after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, decades after millions of people had died in Southeast Asia. Number 4, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah, man. Chinese Americans were treated horribly. Starting with the California gold rush of the late 1840s, a bunch of Chinese workers began coming to the western states, and Americans were particularly vicious toward the Chinese. There were at least hundreds of documented cases of violence against Chinese Americans in western states in the second half of the 1800s. Americans routinely destroyed their property and kicked them out of town. There were straight up massacres of the Chinese, and the Chinese Exclusion Act seemed to legitimize all this hatred of the Chinese of the time. Passed on May 6, 1882, it's the only federal law in American history to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. Not only did it ban Chinese immigration, but it said that Chinese folks could not become American citizens. I argue it's the most reactionary and racist federal law in American history. Number 3, the Fugitive Slave Act. Sure, there's also the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which, yeah, sucked, but it was just clearing stuff up that was already mentioned in the Constitution. Nah, man. The Fugitive Slave Act that I'm referring to came later and took it to the next level, and it was another major cause of the American Civil War. Passed on September 18th, 1850 as part of the larger Compromise of 1850. It made it so that the federal government was responsible for finding and returning escaped slaves, even if they were in a free state. Yep, free states had to cooperate. It led to a dramatic rise of free African Americans being arrested and sold into slavery by bounty hunters. Slave owners often just pointed a finger at some random African American dude and said, yeah, he's one of my slaves. And in response, now the federal government had to arrest that random dude, even if it was likely he wasn't one of the slave owner's slaves. And yes, the Fugitive Slave Act further divided northern and southern states to a point where just 10 years later, they'd be at war with each other. Number 2, the Dawes Act. Passed on February 8th, 1887, the law said the president could subdivide Native American tribal communal land holdings into portions for individual heads of families to privately own, and opened up leftover plots to the general public to settle. It single-handedly led to tribes across the country losing around 62% of their land. At least 60 million acres of it lost by 1900 good already. Holy freaking crap. When tribes actually were paid for their land, they were completely ripped off. One goal of the Dawes Act was really to force Native Americans to be more like European Americans by not only forcing them to give up their traditional way of ownership of land, but also forcing them to give up their old cultural practices to adopt European American culture. Basically forcing them to be farmers when many of them were not trained to be farmers and didn't have enough fertile land to be successful. Overall though, the Dawes Act ended up just being yet another way for the American government to steal even more Native American land. Oh hey, speaking of which, number 1, the Indian Removal Act. Passed on May 28, 1830, this law gave the president the power to negotiate treaties to remove Native Americans from their lands. And yeah, by the end of his presidency, Andrew Jackson had oversaw new treaties with almost all Native Americans to move them to reservations west of the Mississippi to, yeah, mostly less desirable lands. When Native Americans didn't leave voluntarily, the federal government forced them to. This infamously led to what became known as the Trail of Tears, a series of forced displacements of around 60,000 people from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. The relocated suffered from disease and starvation on the way out west, traveling through often harsh conditions. More than 3,000 died on the way, and it's about time we started calling the Indian Removal Act what it actually was. It was settler colonialism. It was ethnic cleansing. Heck, many historians call it straight up genocide. So there you have it. Those were the 10 worst federal laws in American history. And I've decided, I think I'm gonna make more videos like this. You know, videos in which I count down the best or worst stuff in American history. But please remember, these are all opinion videos, just my opinion. Speaking of which, I'd love to hear your opinion. Do you agree with any of them? Are there any crappy laws that I missed? Speaking of which, if you look down below in the description and pinned comments, I have my list of dishonorable mentions. It's a long list. Yeah, there were a lot of crappy federal laws passed in American history. Thanks for watching.